The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series, and Happy New Year to everybody. I hope this year works out really well for all of you, and I hope you've set some goals for the year. So it's been a while since we've been, or it seems at least a while since we've been working together, because it was, of course, at the end of last year we completed the third module. So we're actually going to be looking at organisational structuring opportunities now in local government, and I'm going to cover that topic obviously today. So let's move on. So we're going to look at the program in its entirety to start with. I'll just put on my webcam. Thank you for reminding me. That's great. If we have a look there, you can see over on the left-hand side, we've got the modules that we've covered. So really last year, we've got through units 1 to 3. The last unit we covered was looking at time management and creating, thinking space for yourself. And I often say as a senior leader, senior leaders are pretty much in the business of thinking. And what I mean by that is they need to create some time for themselves to find the opportunities to start to do that conceptual work. And so hopefully it's helped you to just start to think a little bit about how you might not be put yourself into a position where you really don't have a chance to have any thinking time in the workplace, because it obviously won't work for you in that case. So we're going to look at options for organisational structuring today, and then we're going to look at negotiation and conflict management, and the very last unit we'll look at is driving a positive culture in your own workplace in local government. So they're essentially the 6 units we've covered. So let's get stuck into unit 4 today and have a look at some of the topics. So ultimately, I want to cover 3 things during our session today. I want to look at what your options are in terms of restructuring or structuring. Now, local government is very much set up in the bureaucratic structure, or the functional structure, as we might call it, where we have sort of silos where people are reporting to each other above. And that's been pretty much the tradition in local government. And I would like to challenge you and others in local government to start thinking a little bit differently about how you might structure your own workplace. The reality is, when you structure a workplace, you are certainly going to create a certain type of culture. And so, we often talk about local government being very poor at cross-functional communication. That is, teams in various departments talking to each other. Local government traditionally hasn't been good at that. And one of the reasons it's not good at that is the way local government is actually structured around a very clear sort of organisational chart, and that really does encourage people to talk within their unit, in their directorate. And what that means is, of course, that they don't get a chance, or perhaps don't see the value in communicating cross-functionally. We're going to look at a concept called the ambidextrous organisation, which is a concept that came from a Harvard Business Review article, which I think really does encapsulate the essence of what we need in local government. One of the big challenges in local government now is how to become agile and at the same time, of course, to have its own systems and processes in place. And we're going to talk about a way of perhaps looking at that, and then I'll talk about some tools about how you might create that agility in your own local government organisation. All right, so 3 things we'll cover. Now, let's start by looking at the traditional organising structure that's used in local government. In fact, it's used in most organisations, whether it's public sector, private sector, or not-for-profit. And you can see there on your screen that it's the structure is very much set up in a series of units or departments or directorates, whatever you might want to call them, but ultimately they are all very much focused around a particular type of function or specialty. So you've got operations, you've got finance, you've got human resources, and so on. Now that's the traditional way that local government is set up, and it's been reasonably successful in many respects. But as I said earlier, one of the big problems with this whole structure is getting operations to talk to finance and getting finance to talk to human resources isn't as straightforward as it should be, because the structure is very much focused around particular functions. And so the functions very much work things out, but maybe often don't talk to each other to the extent that they should. Now, if you think about your own local community, of course, your own local community probably are aware that you've got an organising structure, but they're not really interested in it. They're basically interested in getting their service or whatever it is that they are paying for done. They're not too interested in what goes on internally inside local government, unless, of course, they work there. And so they're not really interested in the lack of communication across functions. They're more interested in just getting their product or service actually, to actually achieve that. So that's a very traditional organising structure. It's been around for a long time. I would argue that it's time for local government to rethink the way it structures its own organisation. It doesn't need to be in that functional model which we're used to over many, many years. Let's look at a couple of other structures and have a think about how they might work as well. So, of course, when you look at a council, obviously the council is liaising with the public. There's a very close relationship, if you like, between a council and its local community, far more so than the other two tiers of government that we're used to. And so I think that needs to be kept in mind when we're looking at any organising structure. Now, another approach that you might look at, and this is certainly something that would be very applicable in the public sector, or sorry, I should say the private sector. The private sector will often, not often, but in some cases will start to structure itself around its product range. And I know that Starbucks have gone down this road, and so have many organisations where they set up structures around a particular product or service. And so you can see the illustration on the screen. So essentially the only difference between the product model and the functional model is that the silos or the actual organising structure are around products versus functions. Now, the purpose of the great strength of this type of organisation, of course, is that we can get we become a little bit more customer focused, for the simple reason that each of these product lines have got their own, they're self-contained. So you've got a human resources manager in each product line. You've got a finance person in each product line. You've got a marketing person in each product line. So all of these people are working in a specialised sense in order to improve the actual, delivery and servicing of the product itself. Now, this approach, the weakness, of course, as you can imagine, is that there's not a lot of cross-functional communication again. So, for example, if the digital product team have a lead for the electrical products team, they may elect not to make it a priority to talk to that team about that particular lead, because they're so focused on their product areas that they lose sight of the fact that they are part of a larger organisation, an organisation, of course, that has other products and other services as well. So I'm not, of course, advocating that you use that in local government, because I don't think that's practical. It's not a private sector organisation. But I'm wanting you to just start to question the idea of the way we build our organisations around functions, and perhaps we could look at things slightly differently. Let's look at a third dimension or a third type. Now, the three that I'm showing you are the conventional types of ways of structuring organisations. I think this is the matrix model. I think this matrix model is actually does have some application for local government, because what the matrix model has attempted to do is to combine the best of both of the previous models that I've talked about. So the functional model, as you can see on your screen there in the diagram, you've got your functions in the background there. So they are identical to the functional model. But the big difference with this is that now the matrix model has taken into consideration the other type of organising structure around products. So you'll notice that you've got the different product layers going through the organisation, and this is what we call a matrix model. And what this means, of course, is that everybody that's in the organisation is servicing two purposes. They are a specialist within their own area. In other words, they belong to a functional department or area, but also they are also part of a project team or a cross-functional team that's involved in a particular product or service. Now, the big weakness, this is great because it's trying to combine the previous two that I mentioned, and that's great because you've got cross-functional communication happening as well as functional communication. So it's attempting to redress this challenge about cross-functional communication in these sorts of organisations that are set up around functions. The weakness, as you could probably imagine with this system, is that you've got a number of people involved in these cross-functional teams, and essentially they've got two bosses. They've got the project boss, who's in charge of the product line or whatever it is that we're looking at, and you've also got a functional manager as well. And sometimes these things can be in conflict, or one manager might say one thing and another manager might say another. So unless you've got extremely good communication going on in your organisation, it's very likely that the matrix structure may cause some problems, in the sense that people get confused about what their priorities are and what they should be working on at the time, because there's a little bit of argy-bargy around the functional and product tensions in this model. So I'll come back to this a little bit later and talk about it from the point of view of local government, but I just wanted to share with you that approach. Now, these product lines here, we could turn into cross-functional teams. So, for example, in local government, the obvious cross-functional team is health and safety. So we have a health and safety committee across the organisation, of which there are members of that committee that happen to be representative of various functions in the organisation. All right, let's look at another approach. Now, this is an approach I put together based on my own, my own understanding of what's going on. I've implemented this in a number of different organisations. I might say I haven't implemented this yet in local government, but it's worthy of consideration. And what I've decided to do here is I've made it a customer-centric model. And I say customer-centric because you'll notice that in the model, on the structure in front of you, the customer is in the centre of the organising structure. I find it fascinating that when people show you your organisational structure, they'll show you perhaps the conventional functional-based structure, but at no point in that model or in that structure are customers mentioned. And yet the whole purpose of any local government, or any organisation for that matter, is to service the customers or the community. But yet the irony is they're not included in the chart, which I find very interesting. But you'll notice that one of the strengths of this model is that we put the customer front and centre of the organising structure. And then what we have is a series of concentric circles that are radiating out from that middle circle, which pretty much captures customer needs. So let's just go through it and explain it a little bit further and give you some thinking or thought around this. The next layer of the layer that's closest to the customer, of course, are the frontline staff. Now, the frontline staff could be the customer service officers. The frontline staff could be, in the depots, the first point of contact and those sorts of things. So there's a front line that has a direct access to the customer on a regular basis is the first layer, and that would include people from right across local government. You've also got, of course, departments, so we're still recognising the functional aspects of what people do. So you can see that the dotted lines there actually depict the various functions that are in the organisation. But you'll notice that they're illustrated as dots. So I guess my point about that is that they shouldn't dominate decision making. We should recognise them, but they shouldn't dominate decision making as such. The next concentric circle is the operations. These of course, are the people who are basically producing the goods and services of the organisation. So they don't have direct access to customers as such, but what they do is they service the frontline staff in order to accommodate the needs of the community. So the operational aspects are those people who are working one step removed from the organisation. And once again, of course, they have a series of departments of which they are a member. And then, of course, you've got two layers that are interesting. I need to explain them a bit further. The next layer is a project function. And what I'm suggesting there is that any cross-functional projects such as health and safety committees, any cross-functional teams that have been put together, they would orbit around the projects strata. And the idea is that everybody in the organisation is given an opportunity, where practical, to be able to involve themselves in, in one of these project teams. And I think there's a lot of potential in local government for this to occur. So in your own organisation, regardless of whether you're a CEO or you happen to be a head of department or a branch, what are some opportunities for you to get some cross-functional teams together to be able to look at situations across the department, across the organisation or across the branch? What are some opportunities there that are open to you? Now, the last concentric circle, of course, is the strategic one, and this essentially is where the managers, the senior managers, would reside. So in this strata, you would have all of your senior managers, and you'll notice they're the furthest removed from the customer, which is probably very true, and the strategic managers in this organisation, you'll notice there are no dots that are extending beyond the operational, because senior managers should first and foremost see themselves as a leader of the organisation first and foremost before they see themselves as a functional leader. And I find that this doesn't often happen, that people that come to senior management leaders or executive leadership teams, whatever you want to call them, when they come together, they're often bringing with them their functional hat. So in other words, they're prepared to give a report, defend their particular area of the organisation, will start to think about issues from the point of view of how it's going to affect its own workplace. So that's not exactly how it should be. What should happen in those meetings, of course, is that people come there with a broader overview of how the organisation's operating first and foremost, and from there, of course, they can start to consider how it affects their area. Councillors are no different. Elected representatives should at least see themselves as part of the board of directors for the region or the community from which they've been elected. And by doing that, of course, they're taking a more strategic view than just thinking about their own patch. So I'm just introducing a few different concepts here. And you might say that, well, when you talk about projects, what sort of project teams could we set up in local government, for example, that might make a difference? Well, I've got a couple of, as you can see on your screen there are a couple of examples of what you might want to consider. So, for example, what about workplace culture? How might workplace culture be improved across your local government organisation? Now, you might argue that that's my job or it's somebody else's job more senior than you, but at the end of the day, what about if you got a group of people together one from each particular functional area within your jurisdiction of the business, who get together on a not a regular basis, but every now and again, and start talking about some of the issues that are affecting the organisation from a cultural point of view. So I think that's worth thinking about. You can also consider rewards and recognition, and obviously in local government, as distinct from the private sector, you can't reward people with extra money or whatever, but you can think about ways of incentivising and giving people due recognition. And I think that, again, why not get a cross-functional team together to actually start to consider that and to make some recommendations to you, to have a listen to what they may be. That would be a reasonable thing to do. What about innovation and continuous improvement? What areas of your local government organisation are open to innovation and continuous improvement? And could you get a group of people together to consider that in a bit more detail? And of course, local government has been going on for decades actually, about having the need to become more flexible, more agile, more manoeuvrable. All these words are being used. But what does that actually mean in reality? Would it be best to get a project team together to work through that? Health and safety, or health and well-being, or safety and well-being, whatever you want to call it, that's already an established committee in any organisation by law. And so, and in most cases, I believe it's working reasonably well if it's chaired correctly. You could have a recruitment and selection cross-functional team that might consider and brainstorm ways of being able to target the right people for jobs, how we might position ourselves in the marketplace, and so forth and so on. And again, you could argue, wasn't this human resources role? Well, I guess it is to a certain extent, but why shouldn't other people have an input in that, particularly those people who have a strong functional knowledge and probably have a fair indication or fair idea where they could find decent people who could fill vacancies in their own organisation. Now, the last one there, product and services development, is probably not totally applicable to local government, but I think service delivery is critically important, and I'd encourage people in local government to start to think about how they might organise cross-functional teams to consider how they can improve the services that they offer to their own communities. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that you need to go down the road of restructuring to become a customer-centric organisation as I've got there, but I'm just sharing with you some different ideas, and what I'm hoping for you to do is to take away some of those ideas that you think might work for you and to apply them in your organisation. But I'd say the biggest takeaway here would be the notion that you could start to develop a series of cross-functional teams to address some immediate areas in local government, in your organisation at least, which would take some pressure off management. And of course, what this team would ultimately do is report back to perhaps the ELT, the senior management team, and explain their particular approach and what they expect. So there's a range of different ways of going about that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this concept, as I said at the outset, of the ambidextrous organisation. So what do I mean by an ambidextrous organisation? Now, if you like sport, as I do, you probably would be very familiar with the term ambidexterity or ambidextrous. That is, if I'm ambidextrous, I can play tennis equally well with my right hand. I can play tennis equally well with my left hand. So I'm ambidextrous, in other words. And some people are fortunate enough to be ambidextrous. In my case, I can't even play well with my dominant hand, let alone with the other hand. But nevertheless, what ambidexterity means in relation to organisations is an ambidextrous organisation is an organisation that, on the one hand, is very has very good systems, processes, procedures, compliance, and all the rest of it. So yes, it is a public sector organisation, And yes, it does need to have systems, processes, procedures, frameworks, and what have you. But the problem is that what's happened in local government is that's become so dominant that we aren't able to develop the so-called other hand. The so-called other hand is to be flexible, adaptable, and manoeuvrable to cater for the needs and interests of the organisation and the future and, of course, the community. So all of these things require a degree of flexibility. So what an ambidextrous organisation means is that on both hands, we can have two sets of values. One set of values is around maintaining and upgrading our systems, processes and procedures. But on the other hand, it means that we're flexible and adaptable to change and can move and manoeuvre reasonably quickly without, the problems of a bureaucracy. So I'd like you to think about that in your own area in local government, how can you actually make your area of responsibility more ambidextrous? What actually has to happen in order for that to occur? How might you go about that? It's highly likely that it's more that you're going to be more focused on functions, systems, procedures, and what have you, and less so on the other one, which is, of course, on the adaptable model. So you might like to consider that, because I think it's one of the biggest challenges facing local government moving forward in the future, is how local governments can in fact be more agile and adaptable. So what happens is that the seesaw or the scales or whatever you like are perfectly even, that there are certain circumstances where we expect our team to back themselves, and there are certain circumstances where we expect our team to follow the system that's in place. And I think one of the most practical ways of being able to get this moving is to get your team together and find a whiteboard somewhere, and you only need about 20 minutes for this exercise, and you draw two lines down the center of the whiteboard. And on the far left-hand side, you write down a heading that says, systems, and you ask your team pretty much to identify for you what all of the things that they do day to day that actually have to follow a system or a process. So what are all the things that have to, they're non-negotiable. So things, for example, like certain reporting processes, or things, for example, like health and safety and following those sorts of procedures. Those things are non-negotiable, and they would be on that list on the left-hand side. Then we go over to the right-hand side and we write a heading flexible. And we then indulge our team in a dialogue around those things that they do that do require some degree of flexibility and maneuverability. So these are things that do, that don't necessarily have to be followed by the book. You actually expect people to be thinking and working out solutions and showing initiative. Now, you'll find that that list is probably a lot shorter than the first list that you wrote, because, as I said, you're working in an organisation who's probably very focused on the sort of the organising aspect. Now, what happens in the middle column? Well, the middle column is where you say to people, what are all the things you do or could be doing that could either follow the system? So we've got a choice between following our systems and processes, or on the other hand, showing some initiative. What are all those things? And then you get people to list all those things, and of course you just write them down on the list. Now, the middle list is really important, because these are things where people can go one way or the other. Now, if you've got a very strong bureaucratic organising structure, which I suspect you probably do have, it's likely that when people are faced with the dilemma in that middle column about following a system or basically backing ourselves, most people will actually follow the system. The reason they do that, of course, is that they're playing it safe. You can't get into trouble really for following a designated system or process in local government. And because of that, people will default to the safe option. But in many of those cases, the correct way of going would be to actually take the more flexible option, or the option of showing some initiative. And this would be, and so what you would do in your meeting is talk about those examples, talk about real life examples where we're put in this dilemma between fluctuating to following systems or fluctuating to following our initiative. And if you talk to people about that, it gives people a sense of clarity around where the expectations are in those three columns. So that's a very practical exercise that you can do virtually this afternoon if you wish. All right, so moving on from there, this is a very busy slide and I don't intend to go through the whole thing, but you can see, I think you can see there a range of variables over on the left-hand side, and you can see on the right-hand side what sort of value or what it brings to bear. So very much in that middle column of hierarchy, which is typically how local government's set up, you can probably recognise a lot of those attributes that come from the functional model of leadership, functional model of organising structures. And what we're trying to do, if possible, is to move away from that as much as we can, so that we can incorporate some of the things that are on the right-hand side column that really are useful in order to add value to our own local government organisation. I won't go through them all, but it's just basically illustrating that really what we're trying to do is to bring more of people to work with them, so that we've got some of these other attributes going for us as well. So you might want to consider that. Now, in my book, Performance Management for Agile Organisations, I developed this model. And what I was trying to do in this model is to demonstrate all of the different forms of agility. Now, when people talk about agile, which of course is the vogue word, what do we actually really mean by that? My great concern was that I didn't, there's no real definition about what agile is or when it should be actually demonstrated. So I decided to think about all the different spheres where agility would be critically important, and I've listed them on the in that model, and you can see there that there are 7 particular dimensions of organisational agility, and I want to run through them very briefly with you because I think many of them have application for local government. So if we start at 12 o'clock, innovation is how quickly an organisation can develop a new service or a new way of doing things that basically caters for the needs of their community or their public. So innovation's about getting the product out the door, or a new product out the door, as quickly as possible. And the best example of that many years ago was Apple, when it produced its touchscreen technology. Once it did that and got it out the door quickly, the public couldn't get enough of it. And of course, Apple's shares skyrocketed and everybody wanted touchscreen technology. Now, of course, it's commonplace. So that's not so much applicable to local government, but the next 2 definitely are. Processing is all around how can we do things, how can we process what we do inside our organisation faster, but without sacrificing quality. And this is really important to think about, because many people would be critical of local government and just say, oh, they're too slow to respond, or they take too long to get back to us, or whatever it might be, or this application seems to be taking forever. So the question for you as a senior leader might be around, well, how can we improve our processing speed? How can we make things faster without sacrificing quality? That's a form of agility. Recovery is all around when a local government organisation makes a mistake, and inevitably it will. human beings make mistakes. But when we make a mistake, the question really is not anything other than how do we recover from that mistake. So the idea is that when a mistake's made in your area, the public can often be quite forgiving if they know that priority is given to the mistake and that you rectify that fairly quickly. Now, if you do that fairly quickly, then of course the public can often be more forgiving. Classic example of that is if you go to a restaurant and you order a meal from the menu and the meal comes out and it's really the wrong, it wasn't what you ordered. If they respond quickly, that is the restaurant, and bring out your meal, the meal that you ordered quickly, then clearly you'll be more forgiving than if they take a long time doing that, or indeed don't do that. So recovery speed is critically important and part of agility. Local government should be all about continuous improvement, and everything in the organisation should be open to continuous change. And I think, as a leader, I would be encouraging you to be asking questions about how we can do things better, faster, easier, perhaps with more safety, perhaps, with less time. Always challenging the status quo is really important. Customer responsiveness is how do we respond effectively to the needs of our customers. And local government is in a very unique position because it's not just about pleasing customers in local government, because obviously there is a compliance aspect of it. And when local government imposes certain restrictions or, basically, waves the compliance baton, sometimes people on the receiving end of that don't like it, but the point is it needs to be done because other people are perhaps, are not better off. So we need to become more customer responsive. We need to be able to solve problems with a degree of agility. There's not just one way of solving a problem. There's a range of ways of solving problems, and I really think that people in local government really need to think outside the square a little bit more around how they can do that. Now, these 6 that we've got here all add up to a 7th one, which is changing direction. You could argue that innovation, processing, recovery, continuous improvement, customer responsiveness, and product solving are all part of a direction or changing direction. So I've included it as a separate heading there to sort of summarize that all of these things are really about the theme of changing direction. So in other words, if you've got all of these things worked out, it's highly likely that you'll be able to change direction fairly quickly and fairly effectively and efficiently because you've got all of these other things. So I'm hoping that this model might just help you to think a little bit differently about creating a more agile workplace in local government. So where could you be putting the energy and the efforts? What might make the difference? You don't have to tackle all of those things. Some of those things are more applicable than others for you. But I think what you can do is use that as a template to go ahead and start to work in areas organisationally that perhaps will increase your agility. Now, there's another concept that I wanted to talk about briefly is the concept of organisational citizenship. Now, it's an interesting concept because what the argument is that people have all got their job, which is entailed in their job description. And of course, that's what people get paid for ultimately. But also, this concept of organisational citizenship talks about the fact that the person also has a responsibility to the organisation, not just to their job or their function. So in other words, what that means is that people within the organisation can serve on some of these teams, these cross-functional teams, some of these committees that I've talked about before, so that we can try to get as many people involved in these small cross-functional teams. And what that does is it allows the individual to contribute in 2 ways to the organisation. Obviously, they can contribute as far as their job's concerned, but they can also contribute in relation to their part, just being part of the organisation and serving on one of these cross-functional teams. So it's another justification, if you like, for breaking down this functional approach and looking for more cross-functional communication. So I think, you know, when I was managing, if I had a problem, I would often get together 3 or 4 people who I thought had a reasonable handle on the problem, and I'd ask them to meet and give them a deadline, and I'd ask them to meet and to come up with some recommendations about how they might solve the problem. And then what, of course, I'd want them to do is to give a presentation back to me or with my team. So it's an interesting concept, and I'm just highlighting the critically important role here that organisations have, that cross-functional teams have, not just because they're cross-functional, but also because they serve this need of organisational citizenship. Okay, have any of you at this stage got any questions or any comments, any observations that you'd like to share? Because now I think it's a good opportunity to do that. All right, nothing at this stage. Okay, I'll keep my eye out on that. If there is, I'm more than happy to address that if and when that comes up. All right, we're getting towards the end here, and I just wanted to talk end of the webinar. I just wanted to sort of try and sum up a couple of key takeaways for you that I think might be very relevant and to think about. I would argue that you as a senior leader have basically 2 hats. You have the hat which is engaged in the functional area of what you do, but you also have another hat by virtue of being a senior leader to be looking after the overall interests of the area of which you happen to lead. And as I said earlier, this is one of the great tensions in executive leadership teams, is trying to get leaders to focus more on their hat, which is their hat around the organisational needs, rather than just to focus on the individual, the individual functional interests and responsibilities. So that becomes an important challenge for all of us. Agendas should consider cross-functional. I think you should very much, regardless of where you are in your organisation, I think you definitely could start to think about how you can implement some cross-functional communication and teams. Could you rotate your executive? An interesting idea, and I tried that in one local government. That is to get people to move to a different role for 1 month, just to get a handle on what's going on. People will often feel very insecure about that, but at the end of the day, it's very easy to check with the person, one of their colleagues who happens to be the substantive functional leader in that area, and basically ask them the question, what should I do? How do I resolve it? So it's an interesting thought, and that breaks it down. There's one organisation I'm working in now that has a generic job description for all leaders, regardless of where they are in the organisation. And what this local government authority is doing is really sending a clear message to anyone that's a leader, whether they're a leading hand or a CEO, that ultimately they have a generic responsibility around leadership. And I think that's a great way of looking at it. So you should consider more cross-functional meetings in your area of influence. Use surveys to find out what people think. And I think my ultimate message out of all of this is that people are basically tribal. We have been from the year dot, and ultimately people will congregate around tribes. We've got informal tribes, which of course is what happens at lunchtime and after work, where people will meet. And we've got formal tribes, which of course are the ascribed teams and organising structures that we have in our organisation. So whichever way you go with this structuring, you're going to find that it will create certain type of culture. And I'm just challenging local government to think a little bit about the difficulty about cross-functional communication, perhaps applying some of the techniques that I have gone through today, which might assist you. So, folks, that's pretty much a summary. I've got time for a question or two if people want to jump in, now's your chance. I just got a little bit of homework for you as normal. I'd like you, basically out of today's session, is to consider your structure and answer the question, can you make your structure more efficient and effective? What could you do using some of the ideas you've learned today to improve your structure? What can you do to maybe overcome some of the pitfalls that you've got in your organisation? How could you apply some of the things you've learned? I want you to give it some genuine thought and be prepared to be bold about this. You don't have to set it up the way it's been traditionally set up, where there's layer on layer on layer on layer. You can start to think a little bit laterally about it. And I think you'll find that if you do apply some of these things, you'll be surprised at how incredibly effective they can be. So folks, next time we meet, we'll be meeting in Unit 5, and we'll be looking at negotiation, which is a key core responsibility of a senior leader, and we'll be looking at conflict and negotiation together. I'll be sending you out a diagnostic when I send you out the slides and recording, and that won't be today, it'll be over the weekend. So when I send you out that diagnostic, please complete it so that we're ready for Unit 5 when we're ready in 2 weeks' time. So folks, that's it from me, unless there are any other questions that people have got. And of course, if you think of something after the event, then by all means send me an email. So thanks folks, I think we're pretty much done. So I'm just going to close off. And as I said at the outset, have a fantastic 2020, and I hope everything works for you. But I would urge you to start thinking about the way you're structuring your own team in your own organisation. So thanks everyone. We'll catch up in 2 weeks, and all the very best. Thank you and goodbye.